In the heart of the bustling city of Zimba, where the sun blazed like a fiery orb and the streets hummed with the rhythm of life, there stood a church unlike any other. It was called the Divine Light Ministry, a place where miracles were said to happen every Sunday. The pastor, Reverend Ezekiel Mwale, was a man of charisma and charm, with a voice that could soothe the most troubled soul. His congregation adored him, and his fame spread far and wide. But behind the pulpit and the holy robes, Reverend Ezekiel harbored a secret, one that would make even the most devout believer question their faith. Every Sunday, the church was packed to the brim. People came from all over the city, some even traveling from neighboring towns, to witness the miracles performed by Reverend Ezekiel. The blind could see, the lame could walk, and the sick were healed, all at the touch of his hand. His sermons were electrifying, filled with promises of prosperity and divine favor. But there was something peculiar about the way he operated. Reverend Ezekiel always demanded that his members bring their most prized possessions to church. "Bring your glory to God," he would say, "and he will multiply it 100-fold." People brought jewelry, money, even deeds to their homes, placing them in a large golden chest at the altar. The pastor claimed these offerings were a sign of faith, and in return, God would bless them abundantly. But not everyone was convinced. Among the congregation was a young woman named Amina. She had joined the church a few months ago, hoping to find solace after the death of her mother. At first, she was swept up in the fervor, but as time went on, she began to notice strange things. The miracles seemed too perfect, too theatrical. And the way Reverend Ezekiel looked at the offerings, it was as if he was hungering for them, not for God's work, but for something else entirely. One night, Amina decided to investigate. She waited until the church was empty, then slipped inside through a side door. The building was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creaking of the wooden floors beneath her feet. She made her way to the altar, where the golden chest stood. To her surprise, it was unlocked. Inside, she found not just the offerings, but strange objects, charms, talismans, and jars filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Her heart raced as she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly hid behind the altar as Reverend Ezekiel entered, accompanied by a man she didn't recognize. They spoke in hushed tones, but Amina could make out enough to send chills down her spine. "The sacrifices are working," the stranger said. "But we need more." The spirits demanded. Reverend Ezekiel nodded. "Next Sunday, I'll call for a special offering. We'll get what we need." Amina's mind raced. Sacrifices? Spirits? This was no man of God. She waited until they left, then fled the church, her heart pounding with fear and anger. The next Sunday, the church was even more crowded than usual. Reverend Ezekiel stood at the pulpit, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "Today," he declared, "is a day of great miracles. But to receive, you must give. Bring forth your glory, and watch as God transforms it into blessings." The congregation eagerly lined up to place their offerings in the golden chest. Amina watched from the back, her resolve hardening. She had brought something too, a small, seemingly insignificant trinket. But hidden inside was a tiny recording device. As the service continued, Reverend Ezekiel began his miracles. He laid his hands on a blind woman, and she gasped, claiming she could see. He touched a man in a wheelchair, and the man stood up, walking for the first time in years. The crowd erupted in cheers and praises. But Amina noticed something the others didn't. The blind woman's eyes were still cloudy, and the man in the wheelchair walked with an unnatural stiffness. It was all an act, a carefully orchestrated performance. When the service ended, Amina retrieved her trinket and left. That night, she listened to the recording. The voices were faint, but clear enough. Reverend Ezekiel and his accomplice were discussing their plans, their voices filled with greed and malice. Amina knew she had to expose the truth. She went to the local newspaper, where a skeptical but curious journalist agreed to investigate. Together, they gathered evidence, interviewing former members of the church and uncovering a trail of deceit and manipulation. Finally, they confronted Reverend Ezekiel during one of his services. As he stood at the pulpit, ready to perform another miracle, Amina stepped forward, holding up the recording device. "Your miracles are a lie," she shouted. "You're using dark powers to deceive people, to steal from them." The congregation gasped, but Reverend Ezekiel only smiled. "You dare challenge the anointed of God?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You will regret this." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the church. The golden chest began to shake, and a low, guttural growl emanated from within. The congregation screamed as the chest burst open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. Reverend Ezekiel raised his hands, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You think you can stop me?" he roared. "I am more powerful than you can imagine." But Amina stood her ground. "Your power comes from darkness," she said, "but light will always overcome it." She pulled out a small vial of holy water, given to her by a wise old prayerful woman in the village. She threw it at the vortex, and it exploded in a burst of light. The darkness shrieked and writhed, then dissipated into nothingness. Reverend Ezekiel collapsed, his power broken. The congregation stared in shock as the truth was revealed. Their beloved pastor was a fraud, a man who had sold his soul for power. The church was shut down, and Reverend Ezekiel was arrested. Amina became a hero, her courage inspiring others to question blind faith and seek the truth. The city of Zimba learned a valuable lesson: not all that glitters is gold, and not all who claim to speak for God are truly his servants. As for Amina, she found peace at last, knowing she had honored her mother's memory by standing up for what was right. And though she never attended another church, she held on to her faith, believing that true miracles come not from theatrics, but from the goodness within the human heart. Beware of those who use the name of God for personal gain. True faith is not about grand displays or material offerings, but about sincerity, honesty, and the pursuit of goodness. And remember, as the people of Zimba learned, you should never attend anyhow church without questioning what lies beneath the surface. The church that doesn't make gospel of God her priority should be avoided.